The old harbor of Marisport had a language of its own. Gulls wheeled overhead like punctuation marks, ropes slapped the sides of trawlers in syncopated rhythms, and the sea's exhalations echoed against salt-scarred warehouses. Yet for 12-year-old Luca Ferrero, who had been born without the sense of hearing, those sounds lived only in stories told by others. What reached him instead were tremors, the low shudder of an outgoing tide through the pier's pilings, the dull thump that traveled up his bones when fishermen dropped crates of sardines, the flutter in his chest whenever a breeze bent a sail just so. Luca collected those vibrations as other children hoarded seashells. He imagined them threaded together, forming an invisible necklace no one else could see. Every afternoon after classes at the school for D/deaf students in the next town, Luca hurried to the harbor while his mother worked an extra shift at the bakery. There, perched on a weather-beaten bench, perched also Elias Baptiste, 70 years old and nearly as ragged as the violin he coaxed to life. Elias's white beard followed the line of his mandolin-shaped chin, and his eyes glimmered with the ageless mischief of boys who have never truly grown up. To passing tourists, he was another bit of maritime decor, the obligatory busker playing wistful shanties for spare coins. But Luca felt the man's bow strokes in his lungs, as if the strings opened tiny doors in the air and let pressure spill through. On a gray April Tuesday, Luca paused closer than usual, curious why the vibration seemed sharper. The boy had practiced lip reading since he could remember, but reading a violin was different. It carried no lips, only motion. So he studied motion, the tilt of Elias's wrist, the way the old man's back expanded on long notes, the sudden swoop of elbow that must signal a flourish. Without thinking, Luca's own hands began to mimic the shapes, an accidental choreography of fingers and wrists translating rhythm into gesture. Elias noticed. His bow froze mid-phrase. A startled grin cracked his weather-beaten features, and very slowly, so the boy could follow, he placed his index finger over his heart, then pointed it toward Luca. A silent, "You feel it?" Luca nodded so emphatically his curls bounced. He replied in Mexican Sign Language, Luca's home language fingers drawing the sign for music in the space between them. Elias did not know that language, yet something in the elegance of the movement made sense to him. He repeated Luca's gesture, clumsily, as if tasting an unknown spice but liking its heat. That evening marked the start of an unorthodox apprenticeship. Elias returned each day, and so did the boy. Where ordinary teachers begin with scales, the pair began with pulse. Luca would place a palm on the wooden belly of the violin, while Elias traced slow, deliberate bow strokes. When a note vibrated warmly, Luca's other hand rose in a curved arc, labeling the sensation. Small crowds gathered, some snapped photos, amused by the dialogue of pantomime. Others simply felt something they could not name, the sight of age and youth building a bridge no storm could wash away. Within a week, the two had developed a shared vocabulary, part sign language, part conductor's cue, part improvised semaphore. A flick of Luca's thumb meant shorten the note. A double tap on his forearm instructed Elias to slide into a harmonic. When a tune pleased them both, Luca would spread his fingers like a fan. Elias would echo the gesture in midair with the tip of his bow. They never spoke aloud. They didn't need to. One afternoon, a heavy rain chased away the harbor's usual audience. The pair, however, claimed refuge beneath a canvas awning behind the bait shop. Luca motioned a question. "Why do you play the same sea song every evening?" Elias's answer, given in slow English on his lips for the boy to read, was that fishermen tipped best when they heard something familiar. Luca considered this, shook his head with theatrical sorrow, and scribbled on his notepad, "Fishermen deserve new songs too." That offhand challenge lodged in the old man's chest as firmly as a barbed hook. For the first time in years, Elias opened the battered leather case containing his childhood notebook of composition. Most pages had yellowed to the shade of old bone, but the staves still marched across them, empty soldiers awaiting orders. He placed the book between them, like contraband. Luca traced a blank staff line, the way another boy might trace an uncharted river on a map. Elias saw the yearning in the boy's eyes, not simply to feel music, but to create it. They began experimenting. Because Luca could not hear pitch, they concentrated on texture and movement. Elias tightened one violin string until it rang so high, even hearing tourists winced. Luca's face scrunched in confusion. He felt almost nothing. They loosened a different string, so far it twanged like wet rope. The vibration surged through Luca's bones, and his hands jumped with delight. From this, they learned that lower frequencies were Luca's territory, while higher ones belonged mostly to the hearing world. So Elias retuned his instrument to live in the low register. He added a metal resonator plate inside the violin's body and drilled two inconspicuous holes in the tailpiece so more air and more shake escaped. Next, they translated rhythmic patterns into hand shapes. Triple meter became a triangle Luca drew in the air, each corner struck as the beat. Syncopation was a zigzag. Crescendo was the widening of his arms like a sail catching wind. In effect, Luca was choreographing a symphony no one needed ears to follow. And because the harbor's fishermen often worked in crews, accustomed to reading each other's shoulders and eyebrows amid boat engines, many found the boy's gestures instantly relatable. Word spread. The widow who sold shrimp came first, asking shyly if she could learn one of the silent songs. Then the twins who repaired nets arrived, followed by the ice delivery driver, who habitually whistled off-key, hearing or deaf. They lined up to watch Luca demonstrate. Elias would play a phrase, Luca would shape the air, the volunteers copied the shapes. Soon street lamps flickered on while people moved in unison like gentle marionettes, operated by a single invisible string. On the first Sunday of June, Marisport's church bell tower was silenced for renovation. The absence of its noon chimes unsettled residents. Something essential felt missing from the hours. Mayor Joaquina Robles, searching for a way to lift the town's sagging mood, wandered to the pier, where she found a semicircle of townsfolk waving their arms in time to an old man's husky violin. She watched for 10 minutes before speaking. Her voice, when she did, startled the participants into stillness. "Whatever this is," she declared, "Marisport needs more of it. How would you two feel about performing at the midsummer fiesta?" Elias's eyebrows shot up. He had not played a stage in 3 decades. Luca's hands fluttered, excited yet fearful. The mayor, oblivious to sign language, interpreted the pause as hesitation. "You'll be paid," she added, "and we'll print the program in Spanish, English, and whatever gestures you need." Luca laughed silently, his first taste of official recognition, and signed yes before Elias could say anything. The old musician spent the next weeks composing at furious speed. This new piece was not aimed at ears, it was built for bodies. He titled it Symphony of the Talking Silence, 4 movements. Each had a human anchor beyond the violin, foot stomps against hollow wooden platforms, hand claps, chest drumming, and in the finale, an entire audience waving colored scarves in patterns dictated by Luca. The notation resembled no score Elias had ever seen. Where traditional composers wrote forte, he sketched a picture of a flag flaring wide. Where they wrote ritardando, he drew an open palm pressing downward, the universal sign of slow. Luca, perched across the table, approved each symbol with a thumbs up. Rehearsals took place in the abandoned cannery because its metal floor magnified every vibration. 50 volunteers from grandmothers to kindergartners filed in after work. They learned not notes, but gestures. There was hilarity at first, nets of confused arms, a general tangle of elbows. Yet after an hour, a thrum began to spread across the room. People stood barefoot so the rhythm could travel through the soles of their feet. The cannery's hanging chains jingled faintly with each stomp, adding accidental percussion. There were setbacks. An amateur journalist published an article ridiculing the project as hipster nonsense music for people too lazy to learn instruments. Elias, who had endured his share of scorn, shrugged it off. Luca, however, felt the criticism like a cold front sweeping into summer. He buried himself deeper in rehearsal, practicing gestures until his shoulders ached. When his mother tried to pull him away for dinner, he signed furiously that the town's silence needed filling, and that if he failed, the blame would be his. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt from both sweat and tears, and told him a truth he later repeated to himself before sleep. Silence isn't an emptiness if you choose what to put inside it. Midsummer arrived golden and windless, as if the sky wished not to disturb delicate preparations. The fiesta's main stage jutted over the water on temporary pilings, amplifying underfoot tremors. Lanterns hung like luminous fruit from every beam. Rows of chairs waited, but soon people overflowed to the railings, braced for something they could not quite imagine. beliefs. Among them were tourists who paid extra for the spectacle. Among them were fishermen still in rubber boots. Among them were members of the D/deaf community who rarely attended concerts because acoustics rarely included them. Luca, dressed in a white shirt with sleeves loose enough to flutter, stepped out first to teach the opening sign language motif. Two open hands touching thumbs meant welcome. A diagonal sweep across the chest meant share. A circle above the head signified together. Lights dimmed. Elias emerged, violin at his chin. He did not give the customary nod to an orchestra. There was none. Instead, he locked eyes with Luca, who raised his hands in the triangle that marked triple meter. Elias answered by drawing his bow across the lowest string. The note growled deep as a diesel engine. Everyone felt it. Chairs vibrated, balloons tied to railings bobbed, a collective gasp. Vabala's ripples in the evening air proved the first miracle had taken place, sound made visible by reaction alone. The first movement belonged to the feet. On Luca's cue, rows of performers stomped, heel to heel in patterns that mimicked breaking waves. Though hearing members recognized no melody, they sensed design in the alternation of soft and thunderous impact. Children squealed when the vibrations tickled their shins. Deaf elders closed their eyes, their smiles serene, as if returning to a hometown that had always lived beneath their ribs. In the second movement, hands led. Palms smacked skin, first singly, then in interlocking rhythms. Elias's violin wove a low drone beneath, more a pulse than a tune. Luca walked the stage front, translating dynamics into gesture-raising arms for volume, slicing downward for sudden silence. The audience soon copied him, spontaneously. When he ordered quiet, thousands of wrists froze in the warm night, poised at the edge of speech. The third movement shifted inward to the chest. Performers beat sternums with curled fingers, producing a muffled, tribal thud. Staccato bow strikes punctured the pattern like sparks cracking wood. Because those percussive impacts happened against human heart boxes, each player felt musician and instrument merge. For Luca, it was the closest he'd come to hearing a drum. The resonance traveled from breastbone into jaw, into teeth, into skull, where it glimmered like phosphorescence. Then fell a hush so vast you could taste its metallic tang. Luca raised a scarf white against the night and became suddenly afraid. What if no one followed? He inhaled, remembering his mother's words. Silence filled with intention was not a void, but a vessel. He twirled the scarf overhead in the circle, meaning together. First one, then a dozen, then hundreds of scarves followed. Improvised banners, torn from pocket squares, napkins, the tail of a shirt. Even those with nothing else raised their empty hands, palms glowing in lantern light. From above, one might have seen the pier transform into a living kaleidoscope. Elias began the finale. He played a melody Luca had never physically felt before, phrased so gently the boy's skin tingled rather than shook. It was, Elias later revealed, a lullaby his mother sang in French long ago. Hearing attendees recognized the tune. Many mouthed it unconsciously, yet its meaning no longer depended on auditory memory. It lived in the scarves' slow waltz, in the dancers' curving spines, in the shared decision to treat quiet not as deficiency but as canvas. As the last note melted into the night sea, Luca's arms drifted down like wings folding. He signed thank you, and 300 amateur signers repeated it in a tidal swell. No one clapped at first. They were reluctant to break the fragile wonder. Finally, a hurricane of applause erupted, some with hands, some with feet against planks, some beating chests. The pier thrummed so fiercely, one might imagine it launching into orbit. News outlets from the capital descended the next day, cameras hungry for novelty. Deaf boy and busker invent sign language symphony, headlines blared. Yet most reporters found themselves unexpectedly quiet during interviews, as though the previous night's hush lingered. When asked how it felt to compose without sound, Elias replied on paper, "We didn't remove sound, we added sight, touch, and belonging." Luca, sitting beside him, signed a simpler truth. "We celebrated silence." And it answered back. Marisport adopted the Symphony of the Talking Silence as an annual tradition. The church bell, once repaired, ceded its midsummer chimes to the communal performance. Clappers stilled in reverence. Tourist brochures began listing feelable music among the town's attractions. Grants appeared for tactile stage floors and multisensory concerts. In classrooms, children learned the triangle, the zigzag, and most importantly, the circle above the head. They performed those signs in playground disagreements, reminding one another that togetherness was the governing rhythm. As for Luca and Elias, their partnership thrived. They toured neighboring towns, presenting workshops where hearing and deaf participants alike learned to conduct each other's silences. Critics who once scoffed soon wrote earnest essays on inclusion as an art form. The amateur journalist who had mocked them published a public apology, accompanied by a video of himself fumbling through the welcome/share/together sequence. Years later, when age finally slowed Elias's bow hand, he sat on the harbor bench and watched Luca, now a lanky teenager, conduct a rehearsal without him. Holiday lights flickered on fishing masts, echoing the gestures in string form. Elias felt tears blur the scene. The harbor still spoke its own language. Gulls, ropes, sea, but now, layered atop it, was a second shared dialect written in body and air. He at once worried that retirement would leave him irrelevant, but watching Luca instruct a new generation, he understood music, once given away freely, never truly leaves the giver. Luca paused mid-gesture to look at his mentor. He signed a question. "You all right?" Elias placed a hand over his heart, then extended it outward. The boy smiled, repeated the gesture, and returned to guiding the beat, elbows carving arcs against the dying light. In that moment, the old man realized they had accomplished something rarer than applause. They had taught a town to trust its own silence, to turn what many considered void into a gathering place of color, warmth, and pulse. The tide rolled beneath the pier in tireless applause of its own. The lanterns brightened as dusk thickened, and on the wind, though no ear could confirm it, seemed to travel a symphony composed of footfalls, heartbeats, and the gentle whoosh of scarves. An eternal reminder that when people meet halfway between sound and stillness, celebration is only another word for belonging.